Is $140,000 the new true line of poverty in the United States? That's a debate asset manager Michael W. Green struck up with his viral Substack post called My Life is a Lie just before the Thanksgiving holiday, and it has been raging ever since. His striking figure led to copious rebuttals and counterarguments and even accusations of pulling one's numbers out of their asses. But while Green's math has come under attack, notably, the core argument that he's making in the piece has been pretty hard to debunk for people, which is that the jig is up. The dream is dead. American middle class people can no longer get ahead. To summarize this piece, Green says that there's little reason for someone to increase their income from, say, $31,000 a year to $54,000 a year because the difference in earnings will be entirely eaten up by things like insurance and childcare and grocery costs, which the government would be subsidizing if they stayed at the lower salary. Now, frankly, that's kind of old news. Policy wonks and people in my circles have been wringing their hands about the fiscal welfare cliffs present in the system for decades, and they just make sense. If you stand to lose $10,000 in benefits for every $1,000 you increase your salary, then of course you don't have much incentive to increase your salary. Therefore, more people stay on welfare. But Green actually takes it a step further. He claims that these cliffs persist even as families move into solidly six-figure middle-class ranges. Now, personally, I don't think the poverty line is $140,000, but I also find discussions on the poverty line to be irrelevant. We've eliminated absolute poverty in the US, and you can get mad and debate me on that all you want. I work in the system. I know it's true. Anyone who is willing to jump through a few basic hoops can get housing and food in this country, and most of them, if they're willing to work, can move off of welfare altogether. I am unapologetically unconcerned with the poor beyond that. We give plenty of money to help people who will not help themselves, and as long as 30% plus of my income is being robbed to prop them up, you're not going to convince me to give these matters another second of my attention. If you care about it, you go work on it. What I'm concerned about, deeply concerned about, are the people who do everything right in our system and still get screwed over. The people who scratch and claw and fight for a better life just to get their faces kicked in by inflation and government corruption and an ever-increasing tax burden to float the bloat of the dependency class. And that is what is happening to middle-income earners in this country. The line Green was actually attempting to define in his piece would more precisely be referred to as relative poverty, which is a line that measures where somebody's income falls below the prevailing standard of living in a society and where individuals struggle to access social and political inclusions, which he refers to in his piece as a participation ticket. Now, that's quite different than not having a roof over your head or food to eat, but I think Green was correct to insist that it is at this line where our focus should be. And he's also right to argue that this definition increasingly applies to people who were formerly considered upper middle class. While I consider myself politically homeless, my views have always been decidedly in the pro-capitalist, small government, and leave me the hell alone camp. But I found myself agreeing with much of Green's piece, which lives sort of more in a populist, maybe we should eat the rich side of town. And even as people that I have historically aligned with, like the Cato Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, have come out to attack Green's piece, I still find it compelling and felt the need to dive deeper into it on this show. Now, given the immense attention his first piece attracted, Green has followed up with two sequels on his Substack, which he calls Yes, I Give a Fig. And in these, he defends his initial claims on the new poverty line and then lays out proposed solutions to unchain middle America and create an economy where average people can actually start to get ahead again. Because I felt pleasantly challenged by Green's arguments within these pieces, I invited him to come on my show to discuss them and so that I could publicly ask him some of the questions that they presented for me. First, I just want to say I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been spending the day deep in your Substack. I feel like I've gotten to walk around in your brain for a bit, and so I'm very excited to ask you some questions. Obviously, your piece has gone mega viral over the past couple of weeks. Is this your first time going that viral, having this much attention?
Yeah, it is the first time going that viral on this type of topic. I mean, I've been well known within the finance world for a long time, but this is the first time it's really kind of skipped outside of that sector and hit more broadly. So it's been interesting, a little overwhelming, to be entirely honest.
I can imagine. You've taken a lot of heat, but I think you've weathered it quite well. I like the sense of humor and humility that you've brought into the discussion, and I really enjoyed reading your follow-up pieces. But I'll start with the main article that you wrote titled My Life is a Lie. That was the first thing I saw right before the Thanksgiving holiday. And it really caught my attention because I could tell right away that it had a bit more of a populist bent, and I don't know that it was something that I necessarily thought I would have aligned with. But one thing that you did throughout it that I really liked and appreciated, and that I want to try to keep in character with today, is you didn't really bring your politics into it. I didn't have a strong sense in reading it, whether you were left wing or right wing, whether you were pro capitalism or anti capitalism. And I think that allowed a lot of people to really grapple with material that you were presenting versus shutting down due to tribalist impulses. So I'm going to try to keep with that ambiguity today. Obviously, your bio does indicate some leanings you might have, but was that intentional in writing this piece that you sort of removed those personal affiliations from the narrative?
It is somewhat intentional, although I'll be honest with you, I think I'm like most Americans. I'm a little bit of a man without a party at this point because I feel that both parties have moved to such extreme positions and largely define themselves in opposition to each other, right? I mean, I'm getting, in part because of this article, suddenly I'm getting a lot of texts from Democratic politicians, which has put me on any number of distribution lists. And I'm getting these messages from people saying things like, I'm the only person standing against Donald Trump. And I'm like, well, then what are you standing for? That doesn't mean anything to me, right? There's lots of things I disagree with Donald Trump on, President Trump on, and there's lots of things that I think, we are doing an inelegant and certainly, not, many of the policies that are being pursued, I think, are actually directionally correct. I think things like introducing tariffs to rebalance infrastructure and industry back towards the United States is critical from a national security perspective. I also think from a fairness perspective, it's important to recognize that when you have benefit systems that provide people with money to spend, you should actually bias those systems towards production that is done at home from the taxpayers who are providing those benefits. And so, these are important discussions that, as I indicate across my pieces, we've opened up a line of discussion that we can have real conversations about solutions finally. Unfortunately, it's being done in such an ungracious manner that most people are focusing themselves on how the policy is being executed. Many people are angry, and so people who are angry see policies executed in a somewhat vitriolic fashion and like, I feel better. And other people who are understandably concerned about the risks of an autocratic system emerging and private police forces and everything else are looking at it and saying, see, this is proof of my position. And so you're locking in these patterns that I think are leaving most Americans feeling that they're not really represented in this period.
Yeah, I think ultimately I find myself in a similar place to you politically and just when it comes to my affiliations. And I think the dominant thing with Trump is while I think he has raised valid issues with our economy and with just how fair the system is at this point, how much of a meritocracy we do have left, so much of the attention does get captured by more of the culture war angles, more of the personal vendettas. And so I think your piece really was a nice reset for a lot of people that sort of zeroed everybody back in on what the core problem is that we're actually facing right now. And one thing that I really loved about your piece is that I felt effectively challenged by it because I realized in reading it that I have been guilty of parroting some of the things that you debunk in this piece. We often talk about when people, particularly in more of the populist strain and the MAGA camps, talk about how things looked in the 1950s and how, now you need two people working. And I too have been guilty of saying, well, yeah, but you have things that even kings didn't have a few decades ago, and quality of life has improved. And yes, the middle class is getting smaller, but people are moving upwards more than they're falling downwards out of it. And your piece really ripped the rug out of that. I'd like for you to give my listeners a bit of a summary of this. You talk about how these things are not necessarily a choice, that we are really talking about what you call the participation ticket, and that it not only is not possible to live by 1950 standards, it's often even been made illegal to live by those standards at this point.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. And this does kind of fall into the camp of, experts are experts in certain things, and they often don't challenge parts that they accept. That's exactly what the poverty line represented for me, right? I just assumed that somebody had actually done good work and that we understood what the poverty line really was. And for a variety of reasons in my Substack, which tends to be about my personal intellectual curiosity and exploration, yes, there's commentary around markets, et cetera, but it's really me thinking out loud. And so, you were talking earlier that it was a little bit like, wandering around inside my head. That's very intentional. It's a messy place, highly disorganized, and occasionally has interesting things in there, but mostly it's just stuff left in your grandfather's attic. you know, the challenge is that when we think about the poverty line, that was initially set for a very particular reason in 1963. It was designed to identify families that were in genuine crisis, that could not afford food, and were making choices that would effectively indicate that they were borderline homeless, borderline in true crisis. Um, that was done with an approach to try to capture the entire budget. And then in the 1960s, we basically decided to freeze that level and simply adjust it by inflation, the CPI index for inflation. The problem with that is the CPI index is not designed for that purpose. It's not designed for saying, what is the minimum cash value that you can spend for telecommunications? What's the minimum cash value that you can spend for housing, et cetera? Because many of the components, and I use housing in particular, but I also highlighted the televisions and various other components, the way the price indices are derived and created is to try to capture a measure of improved quality. So, for example, houses are bigger today. Houses have air conditioning today. Houses have modern plumbing, et cetera, which in many cases the existing housing stock didn't have in the 1950s. People still had outhouses in some situations, right? The problem is that in capturing that quality component, we're doing a very poor job of capturing the budget of people who don't have choices. They typically are left with what is in the market. They certainly aren't empowered to build their own house if you're very, very poor. Ironically, we see that at the extreme end with tent cities and other components as people who are creating shelter for themselves. We don't like it, right? But the reality is if you're a family looking for an apartment, you're going to settle for whatever apartment you can find at the lowest end of that. If that apartment has been deflated by the CPI to reflect that its quality improvements have increased, that's doing a very poor job of measuring the actual cash outlay that you then have to make. And that's really sitting at the core of this issue is that we have used a number that was created in 1963 that now bears no resemblance to how people actually spend money. And we've applied a general deflator, the CPI, to that inappropriately credits that with improvements in quality and assumes that means there's lower cash outlay. It's just not the case. And as a result, if we look and build up the actual cash budgets for people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic strata, and actually increasingly across the middle, we're failing to capture the real cash outlay increases that are required for participation in today's economy. I gave a really simple example, right? In the 1950s, you needed a landline in order to answer the phone, participate in the economy, et cetera. Although, interestingly enough, like you can still see this if you go back and you look at television or movies from the time period, you could also have your neighbor take your phone call for you, right? And tell you that a phone call had come in from your employer, et cetera. That was not all that uncommon, and people shared those types of resources. You really can't do that in the era of the smartphone or the mobile phone for the very simple reason that you've got your banking information on there. You've got your children's contact information, et cetera. You're very uncomfortable lending that type of very personalized component out. And as a result, more and more families find themselves forced to have access to the internet, forced to have access to smartphones in order to participate in today's economy. The CPI doesn't capture that properly. It thinks that you're paying $200 for a landline is actually only $55 in cost $200 for the cell phone plan is actually only $55 on an inflation adjusted basis because they're still referencing it against that landline.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that I thought was interesting in watching this debate break out on Twitter, I don't consider myself to be somebody who's particularly financially savvy. I often say I know a lot about economic theory, and I'm very bad when it comes to finance. I pay somebody else to manage that for me. Your math got heavily attacked right away. I mean, this was the top target I saw where people saying $140,000 is a new poverty line. That's ridiculous. Candidly, to me, that didn't matter. I thought what you were actually talking about was a much bigger ordeal. I hate to sound crass, but I'm not really that concerned with absolute poverty. I would say we actually have handled absolute poverty in this country. If you actually want to eat and want housing and you jump through a few hoops, we have guaranteed that we will make that avenue possible for you. What I'm very concerned about is people like my family who have done everything right, who have scrimped and saved and fought and clawed their way into the middle class just to get kicked in the face and get kicked back down. And I think what you wrote it really resonated with me because I don't know that 140,000 is the line. I think that depends on a number of factors, which I think you actually pointed out in your piece. Do you have
100%.
kids? How old are your kids? Where do you live? All of these factors can make a huge difference on what that line is. But I do think it would be ridiculous to argue that two people working and earning the median income of $80,000 are living all that comfortably most places in the country at this point. And so I'm curious what your stance is on the math now. Do you stand by it? Do you think it's irrelevant? Did you throw out a higher number that maybe than necessary to get the conversation going? And if you did, it was quite effective.
Yeah, so very quickly, no, I did not pick a number to try to spur discussion, right? I mean, the simple reality is if I'd put out $1 million, right, an even bigger number, would it have gotten anywhere near the interest and discussion? No, it would not have, right? People would have dismissed it as just outright stupid. What I did was actually provide some math and some understanding behind the generalized budget of what I really think is more accurately called the precarity line, right? The point at which people are able to start to save a little bit extra for the next year. Again, look at the numbers that I built up. I didn't include college savings there. I didn't include student loan repayment. I didn't include, et cetera, right? These are all components that are very real components of individuals' lives, and they're looking at that cash flow and saying, I really can't make ends meet. And that, unfortunately, is forcing choices, which is really the key component here, forcing choices on people not to get married, not to have children, not to take those next steps in life. And this is one of these silly things, right? Like if you just listen to economists, they'll say, well, it's not a problem because the household he describes, the two-earner, two-child household, on average has like $150,000. And so that 140,000 doesn't really mean the same thing as he might be indicating. But what that misses is the fact that 150 actually is actually validating that number. It's telling you that the only people that form households are the people who are in that neighborhood. When you're making $80,000 as a young couple, one of you is working for $50,000, the other one's clearing $30,000, or even making $90,000, and one's making 50 and the other's making 40, sort of thing. You can actually have a pretty good life, but that next step of having children, it's not like that gives you money, right? It's not like magically money shows up because you decide to have children. It's not a stocking present, right? It actually shows up only if you have gotten to that point, and then you say, okay, fine, now we're going to have kids. And more young people are doing the calculus and saying, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. Why would I do this? These children are going to be too expensive. It's roughly $50,000 to $100,000 that you're going to spend on top of everything else that you've spent if you decide to have children. And they simply don't have the money for it.
I love that you called this out as a woman who has never wanted kids and always been very upfront about that. I've seen a huge tidal shift amongst my generation and slightly younger than me and people who no longer want kids. And the reasonings are quite different than mine. I think mine were more philosophical and maybe even a little bit more cynical. And increasingly, it is very much founded in this, we can't afford it. And yet there's all of these pressures from both political camps, but particularly the right lately, to say you're a bad person if you're not having kids, or if you don't have kids, you shouldn't get the right to vote anymore, or we should tax people who don't have kids more. And it's so obtuse. It just completely misses the point. And I think your work did a really good job of highlighting, the root causes of this in ways that I haven't seen others do. A lot of middle income earners said your piece really resonated with them. I saw a ton of people saying, finally, I feel seen. Finally, I feel validated. I'm so tired of being gaslit. But then I saw another contingency that seemed very defensive, right? Of, I earn $80,000 and I'm just fine. This is ridiculous. This is hyperbole. Do you think that latter reaction is sort of a boiled frog syndrome showing itself, where many Americans have been told, like, you're free and you're rich and you're better off than most, and they don't want to be told the truth about their circumstances?
Well, I first I want to be very clear. Like, I can't tell anyone what their individual experience is, right? So this is a description that by definition is actually looking at an aggregate, or the expected for any household. There are households that have chosen to live in rural areas or lower cost areas who are going to have a very different experience in terms of the absolute line. In my second piece, I introduced Lynchburg, Virginia, which is the most statistically average place in the United States. And there the line is lower, right? So instead of the 136,500 for Essex County, New Jersey, Lynchburg, Virginia comes in at around 95,000. But I'm going to emphasize that's still 3 times the official poverty line for the entire United States. And so, the point still stands. The other thing that was really interesting to me is the lack of empathy that often showed up in those comments, where it typically was coming from people who don't have kids or who are single earners and experiencing that. And this is one of the things that's really, really critical to understand. If you are an individual who makes $95,000 in Lynchburg, Virginia, so that you clear those costs, you actually have much lower costs, because even in Lynchburg, Virginia, you're avoiding the roughly $24,000 worth of childcare expenses. And so, if you are capable of on a single income hitting that threshold, you're going to have a better life experience because your partner is able to stay home and take care of the children. And by the way, do a probably better job of it than you could ever get in a childcare facility. I think that's a really critical observation around this. And your life is going to be fine. But that's the exception. To make $95,000 in Lynchburg, Virginia as a single earner, basically there's like 1 or 2 professions that would allow you to do that. There's just not that many situations in which that truly exists.
Yeah, I think that was a very poignant point. And as somebody who's mostly lived in urban areas and was single until I was 35, I found myself candidly, even when I was starting to make upper like 90,000, 100,000, still being very much having to budget and pinch pennies and be intentional about where I was spending my money. It never felt like, oh, I've made it, or I feel like I've, really reached this pinnacle that you start off thinking you're going to feel like if you hit that 6-figure mark. And so it does feel, I think, even at an individual level, that something has certainly broken. And for people like me who grew up more conservative and really having the American dream instilled in them in sort of a Puritan work ethic, I think that's what is such a disillusionment for people right now, is that a lot of people feel like they did it. They did the right things. They're on the hamster wheel. They're running as fast as they can, and yet they aren't getting ahead. And when they complain about it, they're being gaslit. And I've contributed to that, I think, to some degree, and telling people like, oh, you're just imagining this, or you don't understand what things used to be like. And I think that your piece does a good job of illustrating why things feel wrong in the economy, and giving people the language they need perhaps to fight back. One thing I'm curious about, and this is really something I just kind of want you to weigh in more on, in reading your second and third piece, I got a little bit more of a sense of like an eat the rich vibe, not outright eat the rich, but more of a, really focusing on how the elites and the wealthy are sort of sucking up the resources, and thinking through ways that can be redistributed, or changing the tax code to make that more fair, and structuring things where we're more focused on increasing production, which I agree with you on. Would you say that is your take? Is that my misunderstanding, or is that more of your position? Because in my own work, and I've been doing a lot of thinking around the cannibalization of the middle class and how it's disappearing, I've often pointed out that I think to target just the 1% is wrong. I would argue that we in society in the middle class are as much slaves to the bottom 10% as we are to the top 1%. And so do you also see issues with the welfare state? And do you think it has contributed to this situation where even as the middle class is trying to claw their way into prosperity, they're being taxed more and more heavily to float the dependency class as well? And so they're kind of getting taken advantage of on both ends.
Well, so first of all, the second to absolutely have much more of a call out against the, in an eat the rich type fashion. I want to emphasize I'm part of the rich, right? I fully benefit from all of the components, even down to things like carried interest, right? I've participated in those and benefited from them. It's not that I'm actually calling out any individual group. It's actually that I'm identifying that there has been subterfuge around this, right? So, for example, in the third piece, I call out the constant refrain that we hear that the 1% pays 50% of the income taxes, and the vast majority of Americans, or a sizable fraction of Americans at the lower end, you use the phrase, were captured by the bottom 10%, right? The idea that they aren't paying taxes. Well, first of all, that's just simply not true. Right. So it actually turns out that when we present data like the top 1% pays 50% of the income taxes, there's a very important qualifier that we're applying there: income taxes. We're not talking about sales taxes. We're not talking about usage taxes on roads. We're not talking about taxes that are being paid for imported goods and tariffs, et cetera. Those are largely distributed on the basis of consumption. And yes, rich people consume more, but they also save a lot more. The second is actually much more nefarious, which is that categorization of income taxes excludes roughly a third of the US government revenue, which comes in the form of FICA taxes. Those are the taxes that pay for Social Security and Medicare. Those are capped at $167,000, and yet there's something that almost every American, through a combination of their contributions and their employer's contributions, pays into at the rate of about 12% of their total paycheck right off the top before we get to deductions or anything else. And so it actually turns out that there's just lying going on in terms of representation of the top 1%. They want to focus on the income taxes and not the overall component. I very explicitly lay this out in the third piece. Over the past 50 years, the income tax rate or the taxation rate for those at the top of our economic distribution has collapsed, while the taxation for those in the middle, the 20 to basically 90th percentile, have actually seen their tax rates increase dramatically. And so, unfortunately, if you're going to actually get involved in this, one of the things you have to be honest with is to say the rich pay far fewer taxes than they did 50 years ago. And that is an intentional choice. Now the question becomes, is it an effective choice? 50 years ago, I think it was actually pretty important, where you had marginal tax rates that were in the 70 to 80+% range. That actually created conditions under which people were disincentivized to save, disincentivized to invest. They often were encouraged to create things like country club expenses, et cetera, so that they could write those off under high income tax regimes. That's just not the case today. And so we're looking at a different situation in which we have radically cut taxation for those at the top end of the income spectrum, while candidly gaslighting people that the loss of services and efficiency in government or effectiveness of government services is just a byproduct of government always being bad, right? I very much fall into the economic conservative camp. I believe that things should be tied to work. I think that things like an expansion of the earned income tax credit, which hands cash to households that are working, but also are bearing expenses for investing in the next generation of taxpayers and workers and producers, is something that we've completely lost. And so, you offered your perspective on it, which I think is a very important one, which you chose not to have children. And in many ways, you're now feeling shamed for that, right? I think that's absurd. But I think the overall observation that when people do choose to have children, when people do choose to create the next generation of taxpayers, we should be recognizing that that is necessary. Right? We have to reproduce. We actually have to raise this next generation of children. And to penalize that in the system is equally absurd.
Do you think, and you have a very intricate plan in your third piece, which I'll of course link for people to dig into, and they should. I'm still working my way through it. But as a whole, with the changes in the tax code that you propose, do you see a propensity, and I think this is particularly interesting in your line of work, the rich seem to me to always find a way out, right? They can always find loopholes or move their money overseas or stop working altogether. And it just seems like when we raise taxes, regardless of whoever the target is, the middle class ends up picking up a lot more than they're told they're going to. Do you think the plan that you put forth avoids some of those historic pitfalls we've seen?
Well, I think, first of all, that articulation is largely a narrative. So I explicitly address it in my piece. We've had taxation that runs at similar levels of tax revenue to GDP throughout history, but the composition of those taxes has actually changed radically. And that's one of the things that's important to understand. If you shift the tax burden to those at the upper end, yes, they are going to work to avoid those. But that's a choice, right? When legislators and regulators decide that they are going to enable exceptions to the tax code through lobbying, et cetera, you're setting up those conditions. Just don't do it, right? Will there be loopholes that are discovered? Of course, solve them, right? We just need to have a disciplined approach to making sure that we're doing with taxes what you're supposed to do. As fairly and evenly across the population as possible, you're articulating a tax collection regime and enforcing it.
I think my pushback is that I don't know that we have the political capital to make that happen, at least not yet. And this is one reason I'm very interested in your piece, is I'm quite interested in creating an apparatus to organize the middle to fight back more effectively against both Democrats and Republicans and pressure them, because right now they have every incentive to continue advantaging their donors and disadvantaging average Americans. But I do think your piece, it has a really interesting roadmap that could perhaps be a tool in that fight. You do seem
Well,
very.
that's yeah. Let me just comment on that very quickly. So, well, that's one of the reasons why I presented that final piece with actually the ability to basically just cut and paste and drop it into ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok and create an inquiry around the things that matter to you. What would be the implications for housing? What would be the implications for me? What would be the implications for how our society would develop? And I would encourage people to do that. I think this is one of these situations where we have new technology and we have a substantive change in our behavior. The Trump administration in 2016, really 2018, introduced tariffs for the first time in give or take 50 years. Before that, we had broadly accepted that we were going to engage in free trade without fully appreciating and understanding how that would influence the development of our society. Now we have a degree of freedom through the introduction of taxation of imported goods and services to begin to have a different conversation. And the fantastic thing about AI or LLMs is that they're broadly available. People can use them to try to understand stuff better, and I encourage people to do that. I also think it's interesting that many people try to attack the pieces because they were written with the assistance of LLM. And part of the reason I think that's happening is it's largely the chattering think tank classes that are paid to produce papers where the overall objective is just confusion, because confusion results in inaction, and inaction creates protection of the status quo, which is really the objective, right? I'm somebody who benefits from the status quo in every respect financially, but I'm watching the economic decay and social decay of our country and saying, man, I don't want to participate in this anymore. It's much more important for me to see my children's lives set up in a much better fashion in aggregate, where they can walk safely down the street, take public transportation, send their kids to public school, etc. That's what I'd rather see.
I thought your clapback on the attacks for using ChatGPT was quite funny, where you said, of course I use LMs, I also use Microsoft and computers and electricity, and that was a perfect response. That does bring me to another point that I wanted to ask you about quite nicely, which is that you seem quite sympathetic to Trump-style tariffs, and I'm curious if you do really believe that tariffs can bring back manufacturing, and especially considering in your own piece you say, when you're giving the example around furniture in North Carolina, that it wasn't necessarily foreign competition that caused the companies to leave and the jobs to move overseas. It was really the employers themselves that went seeking cheaper arrangements, cheaper labor. And so I guess I'm curious, when it comes to this whole debate, if tariffs even can bring back jobs, wouldn't the trade-off still be higher prices, which would of course fall on the poor and the middle class most of all? And if that is the outcome, why is that trade-off worth it?
Well, so two things that are interesting. One, again, I created the actual package in an LLM digestible framework. So I encourage people, download it or copy it, dump it into ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok, and quiz it on exactly these points. What you'll find is that what we're actually talking about is creating far more competition for workers, and as a result, wages rise far more so than those prices rise. Mm-hmm. Right? That ultimately is the trade-off that we're looking at, and really this whole idea of how to think about competition is really critical in this. The reason why the North Carolina manufacturers moved their production to China is because capital doesn't have the same barriers to mobility that labor does. If they were to turn to their factory workers and say, hey, we really want you to relocate to China, the workers would look at them and say, are you crazy? Like, I don't want to live in China. I don't know anyone there. There's no family there, etc. Oh, and by the way, you want to pay me Chinese local wages? No chance I'm giving that. And so the reality is that if you free those manufacturers to take the production that's done in the United States, send it over to China, and then re-import those same goods with zero taxes, zero tariffs, you're actually disadvantaging labor at the expense of capital. John Maynard Keynes identified this 70 years ago, in which he pointed out that you actually cannot allow free movement of capital under a free trade framework, because it will lead to capital arbitraging labor for exactly the reasons of the difference in mobility. And historically, by the way that you protect that capital when you ship it to a foreign country in which the rules may be quite different is you send American soldiers over, right? We did this across Latin America repeatedly in the past 2 centuries. That's literally taking that same class of workers and relying on them to protect the capital that is then taking advantage of their lack of mobility, right? It's just an absurd setup. And so what we need to do is reestablish a degree of fairness in which the capital is not prevented, but discouraged from moving abroad by saying, no, there's actually additional costs associated with importing those goods and services from the rest of the world.
From where you sit, do you think that's happening right now? Because from where I sit, it feels like we're predominantly the working class, middle class people are paying the cost of the tariffs. And it feels like without addressing the actual labor cost and the regulatory costs and some of the other pressures that did encourage the capital to move overseas, it doesn't really feel that practical that they're going to just throw up their hands, give up, and come back here.
I think that's actually the single most important observation is that by and large, the capital endowed class, of which I am part, has interpreted the Trump tariffs in a framework of taco, right? Trump always chickens out. And so, one of the pieces that I wrote earlier actually evaluated the lawsuits against the Trump tariffs. It was initiated by a company, I believe it's called the Learning Company, that said, look, we've got 6,000 products that are produced in China. And oh, by the way, the people that produce it are friends of ours. We've got long, relationships with them, et cetera. And every time we move a product, to a different supplier, it's going to cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000, right? Well, $5,000, first of all, is $50,000. $50,000 is really not that big of a deal when you think about 6,000 products, because you're ultimately talking, it is 5,000. So it's about $30 million worth of expense to change their entire sourcing relationship to get away from China, where they were talking about incurring $100 million worth of tariff costs, right? Well, 30 million versus 100 million is a clear no-brainer in terms of reorient your production sourcing. And instead they chose to sue because they're much more interested in basically saying, hey, we want to maintain the status quo, right? That's really what's going on is that you have a business lobby that is very focused on, hey, if we can avoid this cost of $30 million by spending $5 million of legal expenses, that's probably a better deal. And by the way, we'll claim that it's going to cost us $100 million if we follow through with the tariffs. Well, that math is really straightforward. $5 million in legal fees is indeed less than $30 million of investment. And that $30 million of investment is less than $100 million, right? But it's that existence of the idea that we can get around this, that we can legislate our way around this, that we can change the rules in our favor. And that's the action that people are taking at this point. That's the worst of all possible worlds, because what that introduces is uncertainty. Should I make the changes to the supply chain and the sourcing of goods? Well, if I can sue and overturn the tariffs, then I'm better off, right? And if Congress doesn't have any willpower to reintroduce the tariffs under a traditionally legal framework, which is by and large what people are counting on, then, that's the solution for me. But it's not a good solution for society. At the end of the day, if you are going to have benefits, and included in those benefits are actually payments of Social Security checks to older people, what you're actually saying is, we're going to give money to you to support your lifestyle in recognition of all the hard work and effort that you put forward. But if you're shipping that money abroad, you have the same end result as when you're in a Nebraska farming town that used to have a downtown that was dominated by the local general store and local services, et cetera. And suddenly you introduce a Walmart 70 miles away, and all those businesses are driven out of business. And then Walmart transfers the profits to Arkansas, right, Bentonville, Arkansas, instead of recycling them in the local community. The tariffs are simply a way of biasing people who receive benefits and receive spending from the United States. It biases them towards purchasing things that are produced locally, which ironically provides the income for the next generation.
So you think it's a long game, I guess is what I'm hearing. And it all sort of revolves around Trump not caving and Congress growing a spine.
Yeah, I think, look, first, it is a long game, right? This is going to be, even under my models, which are kind of a 5 to 10 year reinvention, it's a long period of time. And we need to actually explain to people why we're doing it, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're behaving in this manner, why it's critically important. We all have to make sacrifices associated with it, et cetera. This is part of the problem, is that we have a political class that is convinced we can't have an honest conversation with the American public. And I'm trying to change that.
Hmm. I think you've done a great job in starting to change that. I liked that you pointed out, and I think there is some weight to this, that the American people are willing to go through hardships. We're tough people. We're willing to go through hardships if we can see the light at the end of the tunnel and we understand what's going on. But on the other hand, the circumstances that you lay out in your piece, and I think the general sentiment in the country right now, it feels pretty dire. I don't know that shit has hit the fan yet, but it feels like it could any moment. And I think, me included, people don't feel secure. They feel like they are on a slide that they could easily slip all the way back down to the bottom. And I don't know that Americans are ready to go through that kind of hardship. I'm curious what you think the chances are for actual deep recession right now. If you think AI is a bright line that could, potentially pull us out of that, or if you think it's going to exacerbate the issues that we're currently seeing right now. Like, what do you think the outlook looks like realistically for people, particularly considering that if 140,000 is the new sort of litmus test for where people can start to begin to become comfortable, and most people aren't even there yet, if things take a even worse turn, what does that mean for average Americans?
Well, I think unfortunately that's the downside scenario, right? If we decide that we're not going to do this, if instead of making thoughtful changes, we instead make reactive changes to economic events, we're going to have worse outcomes. And under those conditions, we will likely see a further severing of societal relations. More people will be looking to point fingers and blame either immigrant groups or the far left or the far right. And as I said at the conclusion of my last piece, like if you guys just want to keep fighting, then of course this is not going to make any traction. Like, if your real objective is to fight with people, then you're going to fight with people. But if you actually want to make progress, it's actually remarkably easy to do so. And that's part of the point of my last piece, is just like, look, there are very few changes. And by the way, if you go through my piece and you look at the impact components, and I strongly encourage people to look at this. I just got a text from my brother yesterday in which he said, I saw your proposals and my immediate reaction was to recoil from them. And then I downloaded it into an LLM and I had a chat with it and I realized I would be better off. Right? That's part of the opportunity set here, is for people to educate themselves. An educated populace is at the core of every effective democracy or Republican democracy in history. And by Republican, I don't mean Republican versus Democrat. I mean, you have elected representatives, we call Republicans. That framework is what the United States is built on. We can absolutely accomplish it. We can absolutely accomplish it. But in order to do that, we need to be more transparent with people about why they're making these choices. Americans are tough people. We definitely can do this, right? But we also have to believe that there are people that can be trusted. And if you believe in representative democracy, you don't have any choice. Otherwise, you're basically saying, hey, just put my guy in charge and they'll fix it. They promised me that they would do so, right? Well, that's what kings are. I don't want a king.
I agree with you, and I do think that is part of my personal issue here, is I don't trust the elected representatives in either party to necessarily do right by us. But I want to read a quote from one of your pieces that really has stuck with me. You said, this mathematical valley explains the rage we see in the American electorate, specifically the animosity the working poor and the middle class feel towards the actual poor and immigrants. Economists and politicians look at this anger and call it racism or lack of empathy. They are missing the mechanism. Altruism is a function of surplus. It is easy to be charitable when you have excess capacity. It is impossible to be charitable when you are fighting for the last bruised banana. And this was psychologically sound and correct, and I think a better summary of the sentiment that is raging around us, the culture war. All of it really does, I think, trace back to this. I don't think people can and will coexist if they don't feel like they can get a fair shake and if they don't feel like they can get ahead. And so I think this is existential that we address this, right? It's not just about our economic futures. It really is about our social fabric and our ability to continue having this giant melting pot as a country. And I'm just curious what you think it's going to take to motivate the political class to actually start to mean business, to really, and I don't even know, I think a lot of people voted for Trump in hopes and expectations that he would come in and clean house, and I haven't personally seen that much effort in this regard, and he's one of the biggest wrecking balls we've ever seen in the political class in my lifetime. So if not Trump, what kind of mechanism in the political atmosphere do you think it'll take to actually get down to business on these concepts?
Well, I think most importantly, American citizens actually have to demand it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we are currently engaged in an environment in which each side is angry for a variety of reasons. And anytime we see people expressing that anger and that disgust and disdain, right? Libtards, MAGA, maggots, right, et cetera. This sort of name calling, simply serves to reinforce divisiveness as compared to people coming together and say, hey, do you love your kids? I love my kids. Oh, wow, this is great. Your kids look awesome. My kids look awesome, etc. That is actually very dangerous to the leadership class as it exists today, because they've built their positions around that fractured American public. We have half the representatives on the Democratic side that are basically saying, the real opportunity is objecting to and preventing Trump. And then you have the Republican side who run an equal number of attack ads that say, if you don't elect us, the libtards are going to take control, right? And it's just not a helpful discussion. I have yet to receive a political message from any candidate that says, here's what I stand for. All I hear about is, here's what I stand in opposition to, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to demand better. If we want to have elected representatives representing our interests, we need to actually define what those interests are and pick people who do that. I'm completely convinced we can do it. And really, one of the things that's so frustrating about my piece is that it is directed at my own class, right? It's directed at people who have the surplus and have the ability to influence power. And it's largely saying something along the lines of, guys, we need to stop telling these people to eat cake. Right? We're getting very close to the point where our heads are going to find themselves on a spike, and that's not a good outcome. And unfortunately, I think many people in the entitled class look at what they have and look at other people saying, you have too much, as a function of envy, right? We see this particularly amongst the right, where they say, it's a sin to be envious. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or his ox or anything else, right? What they're also missing, though, are the components within the biblical text that highlight it's harder for a rich man to make it through into heaven than for a camel to make it through the eye of a needle, right? Why? Because wealth insulates you from the realities of what other people have, right? You should not bind your houses together in perpetuity is another religious expression that ultimately is saying you shouldn't consolidate fortunes in an environment that effectively makes you a next generation of kings, because that separates you from the people in your community. You shouldn't fully till your fields or plow your fields, because you need to leave resources available for the poor so that they can actually work to obtain a degree of dignity and satisfaction. These are all within the religious text that they then flip around and say, well, it's all about envy. I'm not envious of rich people. I have a fantastic life. I'm actually incredibly appreciative of the life that I have, right? I have yet to have anybody say to me some variant of, gosh, I really want to have what you have, so you can't have it. Mm-hmm. I have yet to hear that expression, right? What I continually hear is people saying, this describes my life where I feel, why am I even trying? I can't make it ahead. And if that's the message that we're sending to people, we have to change it.
Mm-hmm. I want to test my own indoctrination right quick and see what you think about this. So you discuss Ayn Rand in your piece, which I appreciated. I'm an Ayn Rand fan, and I've never really bought into the concept of trickle-down economics. I think that's kind of a propaganda term that was used to was weaponized against the right. And but I am of the mindset that you have to be very careful with over-regulating or over penalizing the wealthy, because they are the job creators and they are the people who are the innovators and who create the companies and who generate the bulk of the wealth in a society. And for the same reasons that I think the middle class is, starting to quit the economy, my concerns is if we lean too far in the other direction and we do come in and put higher taxes on the wealthy, or we make it harder to open businesses here, do you feel like you end up in this outcome that so many people fear, where they also give up and quit and walk away, and we have fewer innovators, fewer job creators, fewer people who are actually stimulating the economy as an end result?
So the quick answer is no. I actually don't think that's an accurate characterization. I think, first of all, Ayn Rand is both a terrible romanticist, and secondly, her general view that people carve their existence out of self-made stone is completely absurd. I've also been a libertarian. I've read Ayn Rand. I've read objectivist literature, etc. It's largely predicated on the idea that government always steps in and is basically creating demands for people. But I would highlight that government is really, in a representative democracy, representative of the people themselves, inclusive of the wealthy individuals. I think what actually caught people most off guard in my piece is highlighting that many of the institutions ostensibly aligned with Ayn Rand and the idea that ultimately we should be independent and capable of expressing our own desires and hold on to the product of our labors, that's very consistent with Jefferson's pursuit of happiness. Where we're forgetting our responsibility in that, though, is as we gain power and influence, if we change the system to further benefit ourselves, instead of being rugged individualists, what we actually are the Balfour Eubanks of the world, who are ultimately the intellectuals who are paid to reinforce the status quo by blaming the moral failings of others. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the greatest ironies of this, right? When you think about the work of George Orwell, or when you think about the work of Ayn Rand, it's calling out people who basically enable a defense of the status quo. Right? It's the pigs saying the greatest indication of your citizenship and your participation in Animal Farm is to sleep on cold floors and to suffer in quiet dignity, right? It's Balfour Eubanks sitting at a cocktail party and extolling people that the problem that the ordinary people have is that they lack moral strength and their moral failings need to be reinforced for them as they sit around sipping cocktails, right? That's the same phenomenon that we saw in the late 1960s and early 1970s, where the affluent in New York City would host cocktail parties celebrating the Black Panthers, right? Or the behaviors around Black Lives Matter, in which it was largely a reflection of a liberal elite saying, gosh, these people really need to be tolerated as they burn down their communities because they're so understandably angry at how badly they've been treated. This should never be tolerated. That should never be encouraged, et cetera. And now we see the same thing where, individuals and entities like the American Enterprise Institute, which ostensibly stand for liberty and freedom, are actually saying, gosh, the real problem is just the moral failings of the poor. Things aren't nearly as bad as people think. They just need to be reminded of how inferior they are. And it's just not a healthy message.
Well, I think it's inarguable that despite the use of libertarian language and arguments and talking points and the highlighting of various economists and authors in our past, these institutions are losing. We've become less libertarian, I would say, than ever. And the things that I support about libertarianism and about free market economics are because they have proven to be the best system for people. If that's no longer true, then we should be open to considering other pathways forward. And if it is still true, then I think these institutions need to do a better job of explaining why these have not been the guiding principles that have been in command of our society and our economy, and pushing for more reforms that would get us back onto that pathway. What I don't appreciate is seeing people shouted down and people told to ignore what their eyes are seeing. It is very Orwellian. And so I really appreciate your pieces. I am going to continue to reread them. I think there's still a lot I can absorb from them, but so appreciate your time today. I'm going to, of course, link your pieces. Is there anything else you want to close with or that people should know or be on the lookout for from you?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the interest in my work. I just want to emphasize for people that, if you do go to my Substack and you do sign up for it to read the stuff, as you've highlighted, it is going to be basically my attic, right? There's all sorts of crazy stuff that's up there. So try to be generous in interpreting it. The second thing I would just emphasize, and this is something I try to convey to people all the time, I'm extremely concerned about a lot of things, but at the end of the day, I'm extraordinarily bullish on humanity. We have the capacity for empathy and for solutions that no other species has ever demonstrated. As a social species, we can advance in an extraordinary way. And capitalism needs to be thought of in that context. The amazing thing about capitalism is that it harnesses the information of prices to allocate resources and encourage innovation. I don't have to figure out how to make my house cooler. I just have to pay the person who comes up with air conditioning and do so in a framework in which their intellectual property is protected for a period of time in order to attract the investment and effort associated with it. That was the genius of the founding of the United States, our introduction of things like patent systems, et cetera. When the elite moved to an environment in which they try to protect that or falsely extend patent protections to create monopolies, et cetera, that's not capitalism. That's a perversion of capitalism first called out in 1776 by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, on which we tend to think that we have founded all this stuff. And then we ignore the aspects of enforcement, right? I call out several critical points: the introduction of things like public unions, the introduction of the Bork Doctrine, which eviscerated the antitrust movement, and then candidly, the financialization and the opening up of our markets in an unconstrained manner to China have really disempowered the worker class in the United States, the middle class in the United States, those who generate their income from the exchange of their daily labor time for an income from somebody else. When you get to that point, you got to start thinking we got to change some of this. We have to have a more honest dialogue around it. And really, more than anything else, that's what I'm trying to encourage, is an honest dialogue. If you lie about it and you do it to my face on Twitter, I'm going to call you out.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, I'm really thankful you started this discourse. I feel like I've already learned a lot from you and look forward to continuing to hear your thoughts on the subject matter. I will link your Twitter profile and your Substack so that folks can go follow you. I encourage everybody to go check out these pieces, go play with the algorithms and LLMs that he's provided. It is a wealth of information. You will be busy for days and days, I guarantee you. But Michael, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Hannah, I appreciate it as well. Thank you.